A case involving California high school students that were told they could not wear American flag T-shirts on Cinco de Mayo. That leaves intact a ruling by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which threw out the case. Thomas More Law Center's Aaron Mercino is representing the students. Mercino tells AFR Talk that they are not giving up their fight for free speech.
With this case, it wasn't a ruling on the merits of the case. The Supreme Court decided not to take up the case. So by doing that, it didn't set a precedent. So it may be that they accept another case that is what they think to be a better vehicle for the legal question in the future. So it didn't foreclose all hope. It must continue. Certainly we are discouraged by the Supreme Court's decision not to take up this case because it was a very important First Amendment case. But that doesn't mean that they will not take up another case in the future. So we must continue this fight, and I don't think that we are without hope.
Mercado adds that circuit rulings have differed on similar cases of student free speech, which is why Thomas More Law Center and others were looking to the Supreme Court. Government officials in Texas are waiting for the next volley from the federal government over the definition of marriage. Charlie Butts reports.
Texas is currently in court defending against a San Antonio federal judge ruling the state's Marriage Protection Amendment unconstitutional. That's before the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Jonathan Sines of Texas Values tells AFN the federal government, meanwhile, has tried to take incremental steps to force the redefinition of marriage.
A federal district judge actually got it right this time and granted the Texas Attorney General's request for a preliminary injunction to stop the Obama administration's attempt to revise the definition of spouse as it relates to the Family and Medical Leave Act.
That would have required so-called spouses in same-gender partnerships to get the benefits of the federal law, but it would have forced recognition of homosexual marriages in Texas for homosexuals married in other states where it's legal.
The problem is that directly violates our state law here in the state of Texas. And so Attorney General Ken Paxton filed suit, and thankfully a judge has struck down what the federal government tried to do to our state laws.
Science says that, for the time being at least, stops a serious abuse of power on the part of the federal government. He also says what the federal government will do next can't be predicted, but is being kept busy fighting other challenges to state sovereignty. I'm Charlie Butts.
Unauthorized gas connections are being eyed as a possible cause of the Manhattan explosion that killed 2 people last week.
7 months ago at the Manhattan building, torn apart by an apparent gas explosion last week, someone improperly tapped a gas line. The issue was quickly resolved, but following the blast that destroyed the building and its neighbors, the possibility of improper gas connections is getting close scrutiny. It's not a very common problem, says the president of Con Edison, the local utility, but it's not unknown. Unauthorized gas hookups have been blamed or suspected in several disasters, including a 2010 Detroit fire that killed 3 children. No cause has been established for Thursday's explosion. Warren Levinson, New York.
For American Family News, I'm Rusty Pugh.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this March 30th, Monday, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and the beginning of another week. You can catch my show every Monday through Friday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Last Friday I talked about, or was it last Thursday, I discussed some of the remarks made by Charles Thompson, who was considered to be the greatest historian during the period of the Revolutionary War, and how he was asked numerous times to give us the inside story, give us what he called, it was a hidden agenda, but he basically refused. And his records, he was busy, I guess, the last 30 or 40 years of his life, kind of writing about this, putting together all the things he knew behind the scenes of really how America was formed. But he refused to go public with it. And he mentioned at one time, and this was in Dr. Benjamin Rush talk to him, you find only a little bit of this information in books around that have survived. And he said, no, I ought not talk about this, for I should contradict all the histories of the great events of the Revolution, and show by my account of men, motives, and measures that we are wholly indebted to the agency of Providence for its successful issue. Let the world admire the supposed wisdom and valor of our great men, and perhaps they may adopt the qualities that have been ascribed to them, and thus good may be done. I shall not undeceive future generations. Now, what he meant by the agency of Providence has been construed to mean Providence meaning God or Christ, and agency meaning the group that considers itself the vicar. And the agency basically in this case is the Vatican. So he kind of told us who was involved and their role in it, but what really was it? And then I left the show by stating that we can see how the Jesuits, which now recognize as the unsung architects of the Enlightenment, how they supplied the American colonies a philosophical basis for rebelling against Great Britain. But how did that come to pass? Now, it takes a great deal of time. You have to go back into history. You're not given much in our history books. For example, when you go to take college courses on the American Revolution, the Vatican very seldom is brought up, and if it is, it's kind of never really given its just place in history and what really was going on. And so, what I did is I tried to look around and find people who wanted to really give us another side of the story, who basically were busy trying to uncover this hidden agenda that our founding fathers were involved in. And I came up with very little, very, very little. And I remember when I was in Rome, I had tried to find some information regarding the Vatican's involvement in the formation of our country, and that was difficult. But I did find some things that were interesting. And one of them talked about how, and this was written in Italian, how the Vatican's strategy was to separate, to divide Britain, and to basically open up a door into America by using the colonies to basically grow its church. And that's exactly what they did, if you think about it. So I looked around and I found, well, of course, I'm writing a screenplay on Tupper Saucy's life, and he talks about the dogma of independence and the Vatican's role in it. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But let's look at some other people who did this. And I checked out a book written by, I think it was P.D. Stewart, Code Word Babylon, Danger in the Vatican. That was a chapter he wrote, The Revolutionary War, How America Became a Jesuit Enclave. And so I wanted to talk about this. as, quotes he put in there, a most colossal conspiracy against the United States. I do not like the resurrection of the Jesuits, and that was former U.S. President John Adams in 1816. Now, when we look at this portion of history, what are we talking about? And what are we up against? Do people really care? I said at the end of my show, I think it was Thursday, that people are comfortable. That's the real problem here. They're comfortable with this deception, and because it's simple. It's the way Americans like their history, in black and white, good and bad. All this mysterious stuff doesn't go well. And so it's presented that way. And when people have control over what has been written, you're never going to get the true story. Then what is the true story? Well, let me tell you how this works. Let's look at something that's going on. I doubt anybody over the last week has not heard about Flight 9525, the plane that was taken over by the co-pilot who flew it into the Alps, and all the stories surrounding that. Well, I get a lot of emails, and basically I was sent some stories that people are doing on the internet that the French fighter planes downed this airliner, and they were using this as a false flag event to see what they could get away with as far as information to the press, to people, and would they believe it. And so you get a whole gamut of stories. So people have a hard time believing anything that's the truth. So they're going to rely on basically the biggest organization, the biggest media outlet, the most, what they believe to be the most comprehensive, the most thorough investigations done by the government of France, Germany, as well as the media, the big media. And that's what they're going to believe mostly. Now, I'm not saying in this case, kind of what I'm saying is that we're sure it happened that way. How are we going to really know? Well, we have to trust somebody. Now, I guess those people trusted that co-pilot, and that pilot led to their demise of 149 people, 150 people being killed. But in the sense of information, you got to trust somebody. So what happens? You trust the biggest outlet that is out there telling you things. And so in this case, people will believe what they hear over the airwaves, over CNN and everything else like that. But the point is, when we look back at history, at things like this, we've had time to reflect. We've had time to look. We've had time to compile a whole series of events that occurred after the Revolutionary War that created this country. So it gives us more of a bearing, more of a I guess, facts to add to different theories. And what I'm trying to get at is we have to look at the American Revolution from a different perspective if we really want to understand why we're losing our rights today, or why basically the Constitution may have been formed so that we think we are free, but we're not. So this interesting portion of American history, and it's hard to find this type of information in any history books. And it's the part played by the Jesuits and the Vatican in the American Revolutionary War, the War of Supposed Independence from 1776 to 1783. Now, on my show, we've done a lot on the Jesuits in the American Civil War, including their involvement with the murder of Lincoln, and those facts are undisputable. But what part did they play in the early war that transformed America from a collection of independent states to this United States of America that we know today? Now, most people will tell us that this war was mainly due to arbitrary and intolerable acts of the British government, painting the Brits as the bad guys and us wanting freedom from this organization. But it's interesting when you start digging into history, and I remember reading a book written in French that was translated that talked about not many Americans were perfect. Most of them were content with the British rule over the government. And it was an act of, a group of, what would you call them, extremists that brought us to this conflict. Now, what we're told is that all Americans wanted these intolerable British government acts to stop, and the American colonists desired to break the British rule. But let's look at maybe a different point of view of what happened. And let's make a comment that religion played a major role in the American Revolution. Now, back in the time of the war in 1776, there were very few Catholics in this country, and there were about 20 priests in all, including one bishop, and that was Bishop Carroll. The next highest authority in Vatican was the Vicar Apostolic in London, who had jurisdiction over the colonies and the satellites in America. But the American Revolutionary War soon changed that. Now, what was the reason there were so few Catholics in this country and so many Protestants? Because the foundation of this great democracy that we call it today was laden when millions of European Protestants fled the oppression of the Catholic Church in Europe to seek freedom from conscience and religion in the most uninhibited wilderness of North America. That story's not told. We're told, we're not heard. We don't hear that very often, do we? And the settlers back then didn't want to duplicate in this world, in the New World, what they had fled from in the Old World. Now, the people back then, and their records, there's some interesting records of the first Protestants that came over in the 1600s to this country, and the records show that they were very, very cautious about who was coming over, and basically, if you didn't have a Bible in your hand, you were considered a suspect. They didn't want any Jesuits here because they knew what the Jesuits were doing in England. And this was well known, and these settlers felt that the Pope, as a foreign ruler, should not be allowed to meddle in politics or laws of America, as they suspected that would render it difficult for immigrants, especially Catholics, to be fully loyal to a new country and to its fledgling, until its values were established. So they were constantly worried about this, and they didn't want any people from the Vatican here because they knew what it was all about. Now, we have to look at this. There was fear of Roman Catholics back then, not unlike the fear many Americans today have of Muslim fundamentalists. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? And if you look at the way the revolution was really worked out, it's quite interesting that it was radicals, supposedly, that started it all. Now, after all, these Protestant pilgrims had recently escaped from this world there where they understood what was going on. Remember the gunpowder plot? Now, in those days, people took Catholicism very seriously. Now, even so much so that several states back then passed laws regulating the activities of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we don't hear that, do we? And we don't also hear that the Vatican and these European monarchs that we're working with had their sights on this country from the beginning. This was a big prize. And the early settlers always suspected that the Pope was seeking to meddle in affairs in the United States, and they were correct, to undermine its values And it's evidenced by every bishop, Catholic bishop was required to take. And what was that part of that oath? He says, I will, this is a quote, I will, to the utmost of my power, see out and oppose schismatics, heretics, and enemies of our sovereign Lord the Pope and his successors. Now, after the period following, now when you look at this, it was very interesting that during this time, the Vatican supposedly had dismantled the Jesuit order. I believe that was a ruse. The history books say, yes, they were dismantled by the Vatican because of their meddling and their intrigue in foreign governments. Oh, not those are nice words. Basically, the attempts to assassinate people and all the horrendous acts that occurred that were linked to the Jesuits. So the Vatican basically, supposedly, publicly disbanded them. I think that was a public gesture, and the reason that they did it was so that they could work undercover. Because basically, if your enemy feels you're weak or you're even non-existent, you have an advantage if you're still around. And supposedly, and then immediately in 1814, when they were supposedly all of a sudden resurrected, doing the same darn thing they did before, kind of strange, isn't it? But you saw a tremendous growth in their numbers and influence in America, as evidenced by the large number of Jesuit colleges and universities established in that century. 22 of the Society's 28 universities. Now, back then, let's look at some things. Now, P.D. Stewart picked this out of history, said in those days, he found from this historian, Rennie Fulop Miller, said, one of Benjamin Franklin's best friends was a Jesuit. This was John Carroll, who had been brought up in Maryland of Irish parentage. He would later become the Archbishop of Baltimore and go on to establish the Jesuit University of Georgetown in the suburb of the city of Washington, the federal capital, first Catholic educational institution in the United States. And according to Robert Emmett Curran, in his bicentennial history of Georgetown University, quote, the Society of Jesus, quote, resolved in 1786 to found Georgetown to supply for Catholics in the new republic the clergy whom the society had provided previously. So we see that from 20 priests, one bishop, how the Vatican's influence has grown and the Jesuit influence has grown in this country. And the reason is pretty simple. Our Constitution allows freedom of religion. An open door for the Vatican to do what they want in this country. And if they could, one day, use this freedom of religion to take away other people's freedoms, like they've done all over the world in the past. And I believe that's what they're doing today. Now, when we kind of look at this history, we have a lot of things. I like to look at it from a point of view of going back and starting to look at a person by the name of Robert Bellarmine. He was declared as a cardinal from 1542 to 1641, and he was created a saint in 1930. And according to some research that Tupper Saucy did, prior to Henry VIII's break with the Roman papacy in the middle 1530s and subsequent creation of the Church of England, kings regarded themselves with their respective realms as the anointed vicars of God for secular purposes only. So, without going into a deep study of the king, we're looking at this division between the Vatican and England, and the Vatican losing its power, wanting to regain it in England, and going to many extremes to do that. But Bellarmine, basically, his theories, he invented liberation theology, drawing on Aristotle and Aquinas. Bellarmine mainly maintain that God anointed no kings, but instead gave sovereignty directly and naturally to the people. So you can see exactly what Rome is doing. Again, telling the people have this divine right, but really they're trying to transfer this right back to them. Now, understandably, the Protestant monarchs loathed this man, and you have to do some really deep study of what was going on during that period of time, and I don't want to go into that right now. But we will. I think I've done it on other shows, but we'll save it for later because it's a very interesting study. But looking back, who was this guy, John Carroll? And I've talked about him before. But he was born in 1735 in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, after receiving a Jesuit education at Bohemia in Cecil County, Maryland. Carroll studied abroad at Jesuit colleges in Europe. He was forced to flee Europe when the Jesuits were expelled from Sweden under the decree of Pope Clement in 1773. Now here we go with that whole part of history that I think even to those who are anti-Vatican historians, so to speak, I think many of them get it wrong. Or let's not say wrong, let's just say they haven't really explored possibly what could have happened with Lorenzo Ricci, the Jesuit general at the time, who was supposedly jailed, although he is one of the most respected people in Rome. And I think that was the main story. He was actually said to die there, but I don't believe he did, because I believe he was here in America working with our founding fathers to make sure that this went right, so to speak. The revolution went in the direction that they wanted it to go, the Vatican, so to speak, and how they planned it. So Carroll, during this whole time, he was forced to flee Europe. And on August 15th, 1790, now we're fast-forwarding, Carroll was appointed the first Catholic bishop in the United States, being consecrated on the Feast of the Assumption. Now, at the time, the papacy not only had to deal with the concerns of this Revolutionary War. Now, these Jesuit outcasts were migrating to America. It was an open door now. It also had to quell the fears of the American people that the church in America was itself no more than a Trojan horse for the installation of a foreign ruler, the Pope. So, there was a lot going on that way. But to overcome these suspicions, the Jesuit John Carroll advised the Pope to have the portion of the oath which required allegiance to the Pope above all removed from the American bishop's pledge. This doesn't mean that they still didn't first give their loyalty to the Pope, but this was done to avoid giving offense to the principles of the Constitution and the calm fears that Catholic bishops were merely puppets of the Pope on American soil. Interesting. So basically, they're weaseling their way into this country under the guise of freedom, and look at how much control they have today in our politicians. They're second biggest landholder in New York. That's just a tip of the iceberg. And look at how it's grown. And although it sounds pretty, I always said Rome has two agendas, and so do our politicians. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy. In order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal on this March 30th, 2015 day in our calendar, the second half hour of this Monday show. And I would gather that 9 out of 10 people in America would know the first thing about what I'm talking about on this. And probably, I've asked people in this country, I know people, there's people, a lot of people here don't even know who the Jesuits are. And they have no idea the importance it is to understand their own country, because this is all stuff that has been really whitewashed from history. And according to P.D. Stewart, and I wanted to quote him now in his book, one of the few people that have discussed this story, in order to achieve the objectives of the Pope, the Jesuits, aided by their illuminated Masonic vassals in America, i.e. the Founding Fathers, instigated the American War of Independence. Yep. Leading Masonic authors openly claim that Freemasonry had a huge role in the movement for independence. That's why you see all of the Capitol buildings was laid with Masonic symbols, was laid with their corn oil and other ceremonies, and they placed the Masonic stamp right on all of our main buildings. And the real secret here is that the Vatican works together with them, even though they outwardly say they despise Freemasonry. Another way to cover their tracks, by encouraging Britain to, now look at the Masonic Review of 1893 goes as far as to state that Freemasonry was the driving force in the formation of the American Union in 1776. So you might as well just say it was the Vatican as well, claiming that at least 52 of the 56 of the signers of the Declaration as members of the Lodge. Charles Carroll, John Carroll's cousin, was a signer. By encouraging Britain to effect into legislation a series of unreasonable and intolerable acts, the name given by the American patriots to 5 laws adopted by the British Parliament in 1774, the secret operatives helped create a state of deep resentment and rebellion in the hearts of the American colonists. You see, they had to create this revolution, didn't they? I believe just the way they're creating a revolution now in the Middle East. They do the same thing over and over again. So they have to instigate these intolerable laws in England to give justification to these revolutionaries, because if you look back in history, most American colonists were satisfied with what Britain was doing. They would never revolted. By encouraging Britain to effect into legislation this, it gave the patriots the ammunition they needed to instigate a revolution. Now, one such intolerable act was a new government tax scheme. We've heard about the tax scheme on imports of tea. This is what happened behind the scenes. Two Scottish Rite Freemasons, Paul Revere, and another Masonic brother, Joseph Warren, one of George Washington's generals, were members of the oldest lodge in America, St. Andrew's in Boston. George himself was initiated into Fredericksburg Lodge in 1752. This Boston Lodge was based in the Green Dragon Tavern, remembered by some of the headquarters of the American Revolution. The Boston Tea Party operated from the lodge. The Boston Tea Party opposed the new tax on tea imports and employed various means of civil and criminal disobedience, including the blocking of northern British ship ports. Now, I'm giving you, we're looking back at this connection, but remember, the stories, the information are brought to you regarding Lorenzo Ricci, the Jesuit general. Supposedly died in Rome, but there was sightings of him in America during this period of time. During the period of time that after the war had moved in the directions they had planned, and during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and there's sightings of him with meetings with Franklin and some of the major players. Now, you have to put all that stuff together. And one such, so we got this, next the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, considered by the American colonists as another intolerable act. But by far the worst and the most notable was the Quebec Act, passed on May 20th, 1774. It received the royal accent on June 22nd, 1774, which attempted to cede all the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River to Canada, which at that time was essentially Catholic Quebec. In particular, the legislation purported to extend the Catholic province of Quebec south and west to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and into western colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia, taking land that many Protestant colonists had already claimed. Well, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. This was a deliberate, provocative act. The legislative extension of the province of Quebec into so large an area of what was to become the United States is seen from the fact that Quebec, Canada's largest province, is 3 times the size of France and 7 times the size of Great Britain. Thus, the Catholics of Quebec had more than ample land to expand within Quebec, plus the vast expanse that is Canada. Now, further and curiously, writes P.D. Stewart, the Quebec Act of 1774 established Catholicism as the official religion in what was at the time the British colony of Canada. And in conformity with the practice in Catholic countries of the day, it provided for trials without a jury, denied representative assembly, the simultaneous passage of the Quebec Act and the coercive acts of the British Parliament led the colonists to angrily declare that the Quebec Act and the immoral pact between Britain and the Popery. What is surprising about this is that the British, who were supposed to be Protestants, included a provision in the Act expressly providing for Canada to remain under the exclusive control of the Roman Catholic religion. Now, isn't that quite interesting? And this provision was to apply to the newly ceded territory. And people say there was no involvement of the Vatican in America back then. How, well, you don't hear about this Quebec Act too much. And most history books talk about the Boston Tea Party. That's about what people remember in their mind. But if you ask them what the Quebec Act was, they have no idea. And this shows primarily that the Vatican was already in working together with these elites in Britain and America to create this kind of create this environment ripe for revolution so that they could gain control. So that's surprising, isn't it? And this would have the religion, the Catholic Church, this provision was to apply to the newly ceded territory and all of the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River. The terms included the stipulation, quote, that the exercise of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion shall be maintained. This was the most curious coming from supposedly Protestant power. Doesn't make sense. The British American colonists, mostly Protestants, were naturally outraged, declaring the law to be one of the most intolerable acts of the British Parliament. Historian Martin Griffin writes that it caused a great deal of patriotic indignation and was widely considered by the people on both sides of the Atlantic to have contributed in no small part to the Revolution of 1776. American colonists, they just lambasted this Quebec Act. It was the snowball they need to get this revolution moving, denouncing it an attendant French alliance as dagger aimed at the heart, as a betrayal of their religious heritage and a Trojan horse. The colonists issued an address written to the people of England, in which they expressed our astonishment that a British Parliament should ever consent to the establishment in that country, Canada, a religion that has deluged your island in blood and dispersed this is what the words were, and dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world. So think about what they're saying about the Vatican right there and the Jesuits, and we have allowed them into this country to this day as if they never did anything. Pretty obvious that the only way they could do it is if their history was never revealed and their intentions were hidden. By who? Our august founding fathers. And that's why it's so ridiculous when I hear people say we must go back to the values of our founding fathers. What? We're going right back to the values of Rome. Now, there must be a question regarded as very suspicious indeed, the eagerness shown by this Protestant King George to thus favor the Catholic faith in one of its Protestant colonies with so gracious a grant of American territory to Roman Catholics. Why did they do that? I don't quite get it. Well, I think I do, because he was in the pocket of the Pope, maybe. Now, another of the intolerable acts was the early Quartering Act of March 24th, 1765, under which the king sent large numbers of British troops to Boston and then demanded that colonists must house them in private homes if necessary. Could that be FEMA all over? And feed them too. And if they did not do so, they would get shot. The reader will recognize that these acts served no useful purpose to the crown, and were clearly inflammatory acts meant to provoke a radical response from the colonists, as they certainly did. It has been said that these intolerable acts were orchestrated by the agency of the Jesuits in England, who had the ear of the king. Do you doubt this? You got to read the Jesuit oath of induction. You'll see what I mean. You have been taught, and part of it says something like this: you have been taught to insidiously plant the seeds of jealousy and hatred between states that were at peace, and incite them to deeds of blood, involving them in war with each other, and create revolutions and civil wars in communities, provinces, and countries that were independent and prosperous, and enjoying the blessings of peace. This is part of the Jesuit oath. Now, in 1768, Samuel Adams recognized this. And what do we know? If I mention Samuel Adams, they'd say, well, it's a good beer. That's what most Americans would think. But he did say this: I did verily believe, as I still do, that much more is to be dreaded from the growth of the popery in America than from the Stamp Act or any act destructive of civil rights. Adams even suggested in the same speech that Rome had a hand in the Stamp Act. Nay, he says, I could not help fancying that the Stamp Act itself was contrived with the design only to inure the people to the habit of contemplating themselves as slaves of men, and the transition thence to a subjection to Satan, a reference to Rome, is mighty easy. And President John Adams is reported to have asked the papal admirer Thomas Jefferson, can, quote, free government possibly exist with the Roman Catholic religion? Oh, there are so many clues and so many things going on back then that we have no idea about. And in 1775, all of these intolerable and supposed bizarre acts by the British Crown and conspired to transform this conflict into an important historical event. In response to the outcry against the Quebec situation, the Continental Congress of the American Colonies sent troops to liberate Quebec from Catholic control. But Colonel Brigadier General Benedict Arnold failed in his mission at the assault on the St. Malo barriers in the winter of December 1775. Curiously, Control appointed a French Catholic priest from Quebec, Father Eustache Lotbinière, as chaplain to the 1st Regiment on January 26, 1776. In any event, General Arnold Benedict, remember, having failed in his Quebec mission, the Continental Congress then sent a diplomatic mission to Canada to negotiate terms of peace. Including in that mission were Samuel Chase, Benjamin Franklin, and the prominent Roman Catholic Charles Carroll. When Franklin and Carroll, see, they worked together. Who says they didn't? When Franklin and Carroll went to Montreal on behalf of the Congress, in April 1776, they took with them Carroll's brother, a Jesuit priest, the aforementioned John Carroll. Whoever seeks to explain the American reversal on the Catholic question must look at what happened in Quebec and the significant role played by the wily Jesuit John Carroll. Now, did the Church back then, the Vatican, use the war to their advantage? Of course. America's first Catholic bishop was a strong supporter of the American Revolution. Carroll firmly believed that a Catholic institution could make a major contribution to the political, cultural, and educational life of this nation. Once the war began, in order to dispel the deeply seated suspicion of the Protestants that the Catholic Church in America was no more than a tool of the Holy See's Bishop Carroll, he encouraged Catholics to fight in the 1776 war for America's independence from Britain. This proved to be the major turning point in Catholic-Protestant relations. Anti-Catholic sentiment greatly abated, especially when, according to Dr. John J. Pilch of Georgetown University, Americans noticed the, quote, wholehearted participation of Catholics in the common struggle and war for independence. And John Carroll, back then, in June of 1789, wrote in a newspaper, quote, their blood flowed as freely in proportion to their numbers to cement the fabric of independence as that of any of their fellow citizens. The year 1776, will no doubt recall, was the year in which the Jesuit Adam Weishaupt established the Illuminati, whose expressed aim was then overthrow of all the established government. Now, you might add, why would a Jesuit or a zealous Catholic fight and die in a war on side that he did not really support, when his true allegiance was with Rome? Because, as the Jesuit general put it, quote, we have men for martyrdom if they be required. Fighting and dying in the American Revolutionary War was a small price to pay for Rome's advantage that they would gain. If this proposition seems preposterous, go back to the instructions of the Jesuits, their oath at his initiation, and you'll see that what I'm saying here is not outlandish. And they said this, you have been taught This is part of the oath. To take sides with the combatants and to act secretly in concert with your brother Jesuit, who might be engaged on the other side, but openly opposed to that which you might be connected, only that the church might be the gainer in the end, because the ends justify the means. And that's basically right from their own mouth, right? They're telling you exactly what they are. And they have not changed. As a result of the role played by Catholics in the War for Independence, and by those who went to Canada with Quebec delegation, respect for Catholics grew, particularly for Charles Carroll and Father Jesuit John Carroll, so much so, folks, that the United States, the elites at the time, decided to put the capital of our country on their property. And there is no Catholic connection, folks. And then you wonder why we struggle today with figuring it out. And today I would gather there is more connections and control by the Pope than we ever had back then. It's just done in kind of a way where people just don't care because they're comfortable with it. Now, as a result, respect for these people grew so much so that in 1792, when Washington was considering resigning the presidency, James McHenry of Maryland suggested, and Alexander Hamilton agreed, that Charles Carroll would run as a Federalist candidate for the President of the United States. Had President Washington retired, first Catholic president would have been him and not John Kennedy. So they've had connections here a long time. And we just don't, well, it's hidden from us, and most people are comfortable with that. And they won't dig to get to the real bottom of what was going on back then. Now, another thing is Washington's Continental Congress declared its independence from Britain in 1776. A military alliance was formed with Catholic France against Protestant England. Next, Catholic Spain joined in. Why would France and Spain get involved in such a distant war? To ensure the excess of the Catholic cause. Now, if you have any doubts that Rome had a hand and benefited from the fomenting of the American Revolution, then consider the following report written by Bishop John Carroll from the Committee of Catholic Clergy reporting to Rome in 1790. Here's what he said. In 1776, American independence was declared, and a revolution effected, not only in political affairs but also in those relating to religion. For while the 13 provinces of North America rejected the yoke of England, before this great event, the Catholic faith had penetrated 2 provinces only, Maryland and Pennsylvania. In all the others, the laws against Catholics were in force. But by the Declaration of Independence, every difficulty was removed. Every political disqualification was done away with. And folks, you can see how the Pope's power has grown in this country ever since. Thus, in John Carroll's own words, the war was a war relating to religion. Of course, the Catholic Church gave lip service to the universal religious toleration as it served their ends at the time. The ends justify the means. Remember that Catholicism was the religion not tolerated. But the Church's real agenda is found in a letter of February 27th, 1785, from John Carroll to Cardinal Leonardo Antonelli, and he says that the most flourishing portion of the Church with great comfort to the Holy See may one day be found here. In this opinion, he was joined by Father Charles Plowden, who gave the sermon at Carroll's consecration on August 15, 1790. And that, Plowden said, although this great event may appear to us to have been the work, the support of human passion, yet the earliest and most precious fruit of it has been the extension of the kingdom of Christ, the propagation of the Catholic religion, which hitherto fettered by restraining laws, is now enlarged from bondage and is left at liberty to exert the full energy of divine truth. Pretty clear what they were talking about. Now, they always love to double talk you. Divine truth, kingdom of Christ. All of that is just, flowery words for an organization that puts fascism ahead of democracy and basically is here to exterminate all other opinions and thought about religion unless you side with Rome. And that's exactly what's going on today. And let there be no mistake about it, the American War of Independence was a double victory for Rome and the Vatican. First, over Britain, having used the light of Calvary, use the light of cavalry over the Pope, the Jesuits and Freemasons to encourage the Crown to pass those intolerable laws, and secondly, over the psyche of the American people. Thus did the Papists and the Jesuits play their role in the American War of Independence, and that's just the beginning of it. And we have a lot more to divulge and talk about. But back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Have a good evening.
In just a moment, Generations with Kevin Swanson. But first, this. The World View in 5 minutes.
It's Monday, March 30th, in the year of our Lord 2015. This is The World View in 5 minutes. I'm Adam McManus. Horrible destruction has come to Nineveh, but not because they failed to repent of their sins, but because Christians now live there. ISIS has turned its deadly tentacles toward this northern Iraqi province, blowing up the homes of at least 10 Christian families and demolishing an ancient monastery. This as part of a campaign to uproot everything Christian from the landscape. In addition to destroying the 4th century Christian Mar Benim monastery, multiple news sources reported that ISIS has been taking crosses down and obliterating Christian churches throughout the region. Beyond repentance for his sins, Andreas Lubitz, the co-pilot who reportedly killed himself and 149 others last week when he flew a plane into a mountain in southern France, told his ex-girlfriend he intended to do something the whole world would remember him for. I didn't know what he meant at first, Mary W. told German newspaper Bild, but I guess it makes sense now. She also told reporters that Lubitz often awoke with nightmares of crashing planes.
Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
American Family News, I'm Rusty Pugh. Police say a prisoner who had escaped custody at a Northern Virginia hospital with a guard's gun has been captured in Washington. Fairfax County Police said just before noon that the escaped prisoner was